Welcome to Comply or Die, the security, compliance, and regulation podcast powered by Opensense, where you'll learn to embrace a mindset that prioritizes privacy, trust, reputation, and choice with a single goal: to thrive, not just survive, in today's connected world. Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, this is Jazz Binning, host of Comply or Die podcast. Welcome to our very first episode where I'm excited to welcome a VIP guest, Aaron Weller. Aaron has over 25 years of experience in the industry with a focus on information security and privacy. Today, he's leading the Privacy Engineering Center of Excellence at HP. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us for our first episode.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Amazing. Yeah. So we have actually, I know I was talking to you a little bit beforehand, but people are going to be able to see your background here because, like I mentioned, you're going to be on camera. But talk to me a little bit about what you're doing at HP.
Yeah, so I joined to set up a new privacy engineering center of excellence. So HP's been doing privacy engineering for quite a while, but didn't really have a single group across the whole organization to help coordinate things and really create those leading practices that other teams can benefit from. So 6 months ago, it was just me. I'm continuing to build my team, but doing a lot of interesting stuff. So yeah, happy to be here.
Fantastic. And I want to dig in a little bit on what you guys are doing at HP. But before I begin, again, I'd mentioned I had a chance to go through your LinkedIn, and I've reviewed a lot of your podcasts. You definitely got a wealth of experience in privacy and engineering. And I know you started off most of your career within privacy at PwC. You've consulted at eBay. You co-founded your own company, Ethos Privacy, and now you're at HP. So I'm just curious, how have each of these roles contributed to the perspective that you bring today leading HP Center of Excellence?
Sure. So I look at privacy as my third career. I know a lot of the people these days have many different parts of their careers as they go through and focus on different things. So I really started off in the audit and compliance world back at Arthur Anderson, which no longer exists, of course. But started off there, got into information security and focused on that probably 10 or 15 years until I became a CISO for a couple of companies in California. And then one of those companies was hit with a class action lawsuit around privacy. And at the time, I was nominally responsible for privacy. And I thought I should really get a better sense of kind of what some of the issues are. So that's when I really realized that privacy to me was more interesting because there was a lot more gray space than the security world. A lot of people with different opinions, the laws and the standards really weren't at the same level of maturity that we had for information security. So I really switched my focus over a couple of years into privacy. And I've been doing that ever since. As you mentioned, I was at some of the big consulting firms. I ran my own company, which was partially consulting, partially a privacy technology platform, and then moved to HP, which actually used to be a client of mine previously. So I already had some good relationships there.
That's awesome. And I want to talk a little bit about even the class action lawsuit and a lot of enterprises. What we see when we are even doing any research related to GDPR infractions or CCPA. A lot of times I think enterprise businesses want what it seems like from the outside is they're more reactive when there is a class action lawsuit, or if there's some sort of a big fine or there's a risk to reputation, then they get into, they start taking privacy more seriously. So curious about what your thought on that is. Is that still the case, especially in the US and, in the Western world? I know in Europe, it's a lot different. And privacy is a lot different. People take it a little bit more seriously, but how has it changed here in the US?
Yeah, I think there's the old phrase that never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's definitely true when something happens that you don't want to happen. And I've seen it in several different organizations where suddenly the prioritization will change or there'll be additional funding for something where it's, that's really not kind of, I want to be in a position where we are being proactive and we're doing things before something bad happens. But it's so complex, as you can understand, for all of the different laws and requirements around the world, that for larger organizations, it's hard to do everything right all of the time. So when I've been in situations where there are those kind of either a misstep or you get a complaint that could lead to a fine or a regulatory action. So it's really interesting to kind of get in before the headlines are in the press and say, is there anything we can do now at this point where somebody has said, hey, you're not doing this quite the way you should be? Are there things you can improve? Is it going to be enough to make somebody happy? Or are you then going to say, well, we're either not going to do anything or we're just going to let that play out? And then that could be where you end up with a a pretty significant fine or a pretty significant lawsuit. So I've seen it happen both ways.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, now especially, and again, when I think about how quickly things just escalate, especially with social media and how important a brand's reputation is, it just any kind of breach, any kind of mishap just spreads like wildfire. So I think now it's definitely is very, very important. I think one of the areas, again, you lead privacy engineering at HP. Privacy laws in the global context have actually been more or less in development for about 5 decades or so. But this idea of privacy by design or privacy engineering is a fairly new concept when you actually, right? So, for our listeners who aren't familiar with the framework, how would you define privacy engineering or privacy by design?
Sure. So I was one of the authors of there was an ISO standard that came out, ISO 31700. Uh, it's a standard that's around privacy by design for consumer goods and services, really. So thinking about if you've got an IoT device or if you've got a service that's going out to individuals, how do you think about privacy? And one of the things I really liked about that standard was that privacy by design, kind of that phrase seems pretty vague. Like, what does that really mean? And it was good to be able to go down and say, well, we want to be, if we're going to be selling, I'll take an IoT device as an example, because that was obviously a lot of what HP does. We're going to have control around training people who are going to be selling that device. We're going to have a control around helping people if they're going to be selling that device on the secondary market. So I'm done with this. I'm now going to sell it to somebody else or Craigslist or whatever else. How do I get all of my personal data off of that device before I sell it? So we looked at very much the entire life cycle, all the way from kind of thinking about what the product would look like all the way past when the engineers kind of say, well, we're good to go, let's ship it. There's a lot more work that needs to be done then, because when people start interacting with products, they sometimes, there could be cloud services associated with it. Is my data in the cloud? Is it on the device? So for me, privacy by design is really thinking through all the way from that conceptual phase through to the end of life of a product. And if you think one of the examples I like to use is, let's say that you've got a smart light bulb. LED light bulbs these days last for 10 years, maybe. And I realized when I moved house a few years ago, I'd put in these smart light bulbs and I completely forgot about them until 6, 7 months later when you're like, oh, I've left those light bulbs in the old house. But then you could think, well, there are now light bulbs that have like little surveillance cameras in. I could have left those light bulbs in the old house and then be able to sit in the parking lot and kind of see, what people were doing when so it's those kind of things where I think for me, privacy by design is all of those potential things that could go wrong when, not just when you're using a product, but potentially, I'm sure all of us have been, you go to the airport, you pick up a rental car. How many other people's phone books do you have in that rental car? Because people want to play their music or they want to get on a call and they just suck all of that data into the car. And there isn't really, I don't think people remember to remove that data. And the rental car companies don't seem to be very good at, they might wash the car on the outside, but they don't wash the data on the inside.
Yeah, no, I can totally imagine that. And what's interesting, I think, with everything that we're reading now about privacy by design or what other businesses are doing, it almost seems like a lot of the newer businesses that I'm sure you went to IAPP.
Yep.
So we were also the company that I work at was showcasing at IAPP, and there were plenty of businesses there. Asana was one of them.
Mhm.
And this idea of privacy by design, and again, you guys mentioned you're doing it at HP. What I'm trying to understand is, does this require a lot more work from the get-go? Like, do you have to bring in the rest of the departments, the heads, the sales, customer success, right? Marketing? Or is that something that, engineering just owns? Is that something that you just own? Or are you spearheading, working alongside the rest of the departments?
I don't know there's anything that any one person just owns in a Fortune 50 company. It's a lot of this stuff is very collaborative across different teams. And that's, HP's had a privacy review process for a number of years, right? We do privacy impact assessments and a lot of those kind of things. But that's often more we're looking more at it from a risk lens rather than from an engineering lens. So really kind of where my team is adding additional functionality to what we already did is around saying, well, okay, you told me this is your data flow diagram, but can I look at the code? Can I really get into how does this actually work? And even looking towards some of the newer tools, which would allow us to do kind of code review as part of that design process, similar to what security folks have been doing for years. Back when I was a CISO 10 or 15 years ago, we would have white box code review tools and look for SQL injections and other kinds of security vulnerabilities. We're now getting to the point where we can do some of those same things with privacy, because privacy, as I mentioned earlier, is a bit more nuanced. It's taken a while for those tools to mature. But really, we're looking at how do you get everything from what is this thing supposed to do? what's the user experience piece look like as well, which is kind of part of what I'm developing for my center of excellence, looking at how do you make privacy and security experiences that are usable, as well as they're ones that obviously comply with the requirements and help to be transparent and all of those other things as well. So we're looking at it all from kind of the user experience down into the code itself. Where are we sharing data with third parties on the back end? So it's really kind of that whole package. But as I said, we're really trying to expand. And I think what we've done, and even if you look in laws like GDPR, very vague on kind of what a kind of privacy assessment. They say do privacy by design and default, but don't really give you that much detail on kind of how. So we're looking at it from an engineer's point of view, right? I'm hiring people who either are or have been software engineers and say, well, this is kind of where the process can break down. And we would look for those areas and make sure everything's okay.
Awesome. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, especially the legal portion of it, which is abstract. Actually leads me to my next question. There's a lot of debate about lawyers and the tech developers, the innovators, that they don't speak the same language. And so there's a gap when it comes to translating the abstract legal principles. Obviously, privacy laws are changing daily. And so how do you actually translate that, especially you do it for your team, into concrete engineering steps? And how do you actually then bring that into fruition?
So there's a great analogy that I stole from my boss a few weeks ago that he said that lawyers tend to be more analog in their thinking, lots of shades of gray, and engineers are very digital. And I like that because one of my hobbies is audio equipment. And you've got a digital to analog converter is kind of one of those key pieces. If you've got a stream of music, but you want to play it out of a speaker, at some point you're going to translate it from digital to analog. And I see that really as being one of the roles that my team has, is to say, we need to understand the law enough to understand what a lawyer is getting at, but we also need to understand the engineer's point of view enough as well, and be that translation layer in the middle. So I would say a lot of the roles that I've done over the last few years, I'm not a lawyer by background. I come through kind of more of the engineering technical side of things, but I've worked with enough lawyers. I've had enough lawyers work for me that you really get that sense of kind of how they're thinking about some of this stuff. So I agree that that translation layer is absolutely critical. And that's one of the things that my team is doing as well, is creating, because a lot of engineers would work in a ticketing system like Jira. They're not going to work in kind of the OneTrust or the other kind of privacy tools that organizations tend to use. So we're looking at how do we get that guidance that we're providing, not in a Word policy document, but in something that can be dropped into or copied into a Jira ticket, where they can say, here are the things that I actually need to do. And you're talking to me already in that language that I understand. I don't need to go and read a policy and try and work out what that means. Or even worse, I don't need to go and try and read the law and then second guess what the lawyers are saying. Like, we never want anyone to do that. Let them do their job and then let the engineers do theirs, with that kind of that enablement layer that my team provides in the middle.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes sense. And I think because of your experience, you have more of a holistic view. So you've been able to bring that into the work that you're doing at HP. Besides the legal and tech, if you think about it, again, privacy laws changing every single day. The privacy considerations aren't well understood, especially beyond your team. How do you evangelize the importance of data governance, gain buy-in across your organization from end to end, right? From engineering all the way to sales and marketing, especially with so many competing priorities, and then from top to bottom, from your peers all the way down to at the employee level, to make sure that they are all doing what they need to do to comply and being ethical and responsible with the customer data. So how do you get every business unit working together? And then how do you enforce that? Curious what your perspective on that is.
Sure. So there's several teams that actually work on that overall problem. So I work very closely. We have a dedicated data governance team that I work very closely with. And really, data governance and privacy, it's another one of those Venn diagrams similar to privacy and security, where data governance cares about any kind of data that could be important to the company, whether it's a trade secret, whether it's unreleased financials, we're about to buy another company, a lot of those things that may not have any personal information in them. So from a privacy law perspective, they're just out of scope. So that's kind of where, but we still look for what is the data, how are people using it, are they, taking appropriate safeguards. So there's a lot of that same baseline of thinking that's in place. So yeah, we do try and evangelize through multiple channels. We had an internal conference last week that I had a keynote at, where it's really all of the data teams across the company coming together and saying, what kind of work are you doing? How can we help each other? Do you have any other ideas? So there's a lot of those kind of things that we do within the organization, where we get almost that cross-functional group together and say, what are the things that are really important for you to know about, and really to help you to be able to do your jobs without having to go and reinvent some of these wheels. when we may already have some guidance or some tool sets that will allow you to get there without having to go and build them yourselves.
Have you noticed maybe not at HP, but in past companies, right? Other places that you've worked or when you're working as a consultant, that there are those competing kind of priorities where it's difficult for the rest of the other departments to actually take privacy and data management and data governance as seriously as your department is?
I think it does vary significantly by company. Yeah, I've worked with a lot of companies across various sectors over the years. So, retail organizations, very different from banks, very different from tech companies. And even within those sectors, you may find that different, just different style, different culture means that different priorities for some of these things. But I think I've been lucky in that I've generally worked with companies that do care about this stuff. They're the better kind of clients to have, right? It's not much fun to go into an organization where you know that they don't really care and they're just doing it, almost for a paper compliance program. That's not that much interest for me to be doing those things. But yeah, I think it's a lot of companies, once you get outside of the Fortune 1000, they don't think they're going to be a target. And I think we've seen that more recently where regulators have been coming after those smaller companies and saying, look, just because you don't have necessarily that huge brand name, don't think you're safe. Which I think is a good thing because the laws do apply to every company. And while larger companies may have more resources to be working on some of these problems, there's still a lot of damage that can be done if a smaller company has an issue around, what data they've collected, who they've shared it with, all those kind of things. So I think that's part of the solution as well, is looking at how do we help regulators to, apply things fairly and not just go after the big names, but also to really be looking at where the risk of harm is. Because as a consumer, right, we should be caring about what's going to hurt me from a result of some company having my data and using it in a way that either I didn't agree to in the first place, or is just something that I would never have agreed to, and now I find out kind of often.
Yeah, I think the sentiment is changing. Again, privacy, when you think about from like a European context, it's a big deal.
Mhm.
US and Canada, not so much. I'm in Canada, right? So I know for a while there was a lot of noise when Castle came into effect.
Mhm.
Oh, there was a lot of panic. There were a lot of companies who were reacting to the news. Even though when you think about it, we had about 3 year lead time before they actually ended up rolling out Castle. When you think about US and a lot of the changes that are happening are based off of what you know. And again, you've spoken at IAPP, you've attended many different conferences, you understand from a global context. Is it changing? Are people taking US consumers and Canadian consumers taking it more seriously?
I think there's a little bit of that, and there's a lot of noise around people don't really care about their privacy, which really, when you kind of dig into it, I don't think it's not as true. They may care about it differently, or they have different assumptions going in. But yeah, I think that consumers generally care when something happens to them, and that's what we've seen when we first started doing breach response notices right back a few years ago with SB 1386 in California, and suddenly you get these letters in the mail, and you'd be like, "Oh, my data's being breached." And the first few were really frightening and scary. But now everybody I know has had, multiple ones over the years, and it's just become that background noise. And I do worry a little bit that it can be the same. It really is the same with cookie banners, or the famous thing about nobody actually reads privacy notices, or, a lot of the stuff that we tend to do that we think is providing that transparency. It's telling people kind of to allow them to make a reasoned choice just becomes overwhelming. And then they're like, well, I can't care. It's not so much that they don't care. They just don't have the ability to care every single time they go to a website to kind of make those selections. So I think some of the more recent developments, like the global privacy control, which would be in the browser and say, this is my default setting for the cookie settings, rather than having to make that on an individual basis, right? There are some kind of consumer technologies that are developing out there around how would I almost provide, this is my standard set of things that I want to do. And if a website's in line with that, cool, I just go straight in. Otherwise, I will then have to make that decision. So I think it's got way too complicated at the moment. Even people who do care about their privacy, it's overwhelming. I click past a couple of cookie banners a day, fine, just I want to get to the article or whatever else, because you can't consume that much privacy information. But I do think the pendulum will swing back the other way. It's got to be more simplified, because really otherwise it's just paying lip service. If nobody's actually using those controls, then why do we go to all the effort to produce them in the first place, right? It's not really helping. And I've had that discussion as well with that. If you look at the number of people who respond to or request, give me access to my data or delete my data, it's usually a tiny fraction of 1% of people that actually do that. So companies are spending millions and millions of dollars on all of the technology and all of the process and everything else to go and put all that stuff together in the back end. Is that really meaningful to people's privacy? Are there better places you could spend the same money and have a better result? Right. That's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to think about with my team is like, where are the places where we can maybe make a big difference that's not necessarily being driven by legislation, but it's being driven by, we want to be transparent. We want to show you exactly what we're doing. We want to have that control so that we can give that control to our users as well.
Got it. Yeah. No, I think I don't know if you've actually reviewed, so you've been on Netflix and you've seen the Black Mirror episodes. They just had a recent one, so they just released 6 different episodes. And the latest one was all about, I'm not going to get into the plot, but
Yeah, I'm
the,
not caught up yet. So please
yeah,
don't.
well, in it, the woman had basically agreed, which we all do, right? You see a privacy and you just agree all. And at that point, it showed that, there was a plot, there was a climax, and she realized nobody reads that. I just read it and I accept. So, besides just consumers feeling overwhelmed with the sheer amount of information that's out there, they feel they have no controls. So they just trust the businesses until they realize their trust has, again, if there's a data breach, whatever, then at that point, it's like, man, what am I supposed to do now? So besides that, how have you noticed your guys' customers? Do they take it more seriously, especially as a technology company? And a lot of your customers, I'm sure, are also enterprise brands. Are they taking it more seriously where it's not just, hey, this seems like a reputable organization. They are doing what they can to protect. But is that something that you guys have noticed a shift and a change in your customers' behavior?
Yeah, we do try to optimize those experiences, right? Because we want to make it easy for people to understand what they're doing and to do the right things. There are variations in countries. I've seen that over different companies over a number of years as to kind of how many people will say, I'll give you this data or I won't give you this data. So I think there's a lot of effort that goes into designing those experiences. But one of the things that always has interested me about privacy is that it's so contextual and so culturally contextual as well. That one experience that may play well to an American audience may not play well to a German audience. So you've kind of got that layer of nuance to it as well, that it's very hard when you're designing for a global audience to try and get one thing that aligns with the way that everybody expects to see it.
And how have you guys been able to use, and actually, what's your perspective on leveraging more technology solutions, which again bring in a whole new set of issues, right? Because you've got more technology, it's integrated within your systems. It's also collecting data, but in an effort to help manage and enforce your guys' privacy programs. Is there something that you guys look for when you're trying to, again, remove all the silos and find a way to just make the data usable and have more data collected in a way that is actually benefiting the end user?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I'm actively working on right now, where like a lot of large organizations, we have a number of approved data products. So they've gone through a cleansing process, right? They're available if you have the right access permissions to go and do those. And we're looking at how can we create privacy enhanced versions of some of those data products where you're trying to keep the privacy or preserve the privacy, but maintain some utility in that data set as well. Right. Because if you have a data set that's fully identified. And you can say, well, now I can email Aaron because I have his email address in the data set. But it might be that you're looking for something more like, does one model of printer, work better or use more ink to produce the same number of pages than another one? In which case you might need a version of that data set that doesn't really have any personal information in there. So that's some of the stuff that we're looking at is, like I was saying earlier with the Jira tickets, how do we meet people where they are in the process within the organization? So instead of saying, well, we're now going to have this whole completely separate privacy portal, you've got to know it exists, you've got to come to us. It's when you're going to the catalog and picking something that you're going to use anyway, we say, well, do you really need that? Could you have an anonymized version of this data set? Would that work for you? So doing some work around how can you provide people with the right level of identifiability in a data set while not breaking kind of what it is they're trying to do, particularly from an analytics perspective, right? Where some of the things you can do to a data set, if you're familiar with differential privacy, where you're adding in kind of that statistical noise to a data set, works very well for some things. If I'm looking as to where I'm going to open a new Costco location, for example, I don't need to know that there are 54 people in one zip code versus 55. What I care about is, are there thousands of people, right? At that, so you can do things in that data set to still give you that outcome without necessarily having all of that privacy risk. And that's one of the big things we're working on right now is how do I provide almost that tool set of things where people can get the right data set in a way that's got the right amount of privacy protections, but still enables the business to get some of the things they want done.
Yeah, awesome. And I know again we mentioned earlier in the conversation, even tools like AI, everything. I think when you go onto LinkedIn, that's all everyone's talking about now, and they're good and bad, right? When you're looking towards the future, what emerging trends or tech do you see that is shaping the landscape of data privacy, especially for enterprise businesses? And with AI, for example, Chat GPT or Bard. I don't have access to Bard yet in Canada, but with so much information being collected and processed, there's potential for good and bad. Data collection obviously is inevitable. It's not going anywhere. So how do you balance the enterprise needs with consumer privacy? And what is your take on it? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it really depend on the enterprise that's actually using it for hopefully good?
It takes me back a few years to when was cloud a good thing or a bad thing, or kind of how do we migrate to the cloud, or kind of we're being left behind because we're not going to the cloud. So AI for me is a little bit like that, where yes, there are some unique aspects to it, but just like we did with many other technology waves before this, a lot of the governance principles are going to be the same, right? Understand what the use case is, what are the risks. I was just on a presentation earlier with someone from NIST talking about their risk management framework for AI and how they're thinking about it. So we're, I think, starting to develop those standards fairly quickly, given a lot of the hype has been from early 2023. Although a lot of these technologies are not really new, they're variations of things that have been around for a number of years. So I would say it's both. I think there is a lot of risk, but there's also a lot of potential. Some of the use cases that I've seen, demonstrated, they really do free up a lot of, I would say, manual kind of work. But there's also risk around that as well, particularly where one of the things that I learned was that if you give a large language model a question, it has to give you an answer. Even if it doesn't know, it has to give you an answer. So we're not yet at the point where you can then distinguish between, I saw an example this morning where somebody asked to encrypt using a certain algorithm, and it gave an answer back that was completely wrong. It made it up, right? Which is kind of one of the things where we're still kind of learning what are the things where that answer is not correct, and I shouldn't use that because it's then going to break something down the line. So obviously very early days of, certainly with generative AI technologies, lots of work to be done around kind of building that governance framework. But I mean, the European Union published the EU AI. So that is really, I think, going to be setting the stage again. I know there's a lot of efforts in the US and other countries as well on similar, like how do we think about managing this before it gets out of hand? But I'm pretty impressed that all of these organizations and countries, that's been pretty quick, really, to be developing and kind of building these things, because a lot of it's built on kind of the shoulders of the stuff we've done before. So while there are some unique AI risks, there really is a lot that can be reused from data governance and privacy and other disciplines. We've been thinking about other kinds of risk for a number of years now.
Got it. I wasn't around when the big shift happened, or I was around, but I wasn't paying that much attention to the shift to cloud. But everything does end up kind of being reused and recycled. When you think about blockchain was hot a couple of years
Mhm.
ago, or
Yep.
like 2017. And then there was a lot of talk around regulations around that to prevent privacy professionals and even enterprise businesses from getting distracted by just the trends, whether changes in technology. What do you feel, especially you've mentioned before, you've been around and you have witnessed a lot of the age of, digital transformation. And now we've got all of this talk around AI. What do you think is the most important key principles for businesses and enterprise compliance professionals to focus on to stick to the basics?
Sure. I think one thing that's, again, this is not a new idea, but it's make the happy path easy. So make it easy for people to be able to get some benefit and use these tools in a way that's controlled, and then make the unhappy path hard. So again, I use the cloud analogy, but when cloud came out, one of the first things that the technologies that kind of were inspired by that, there was, we moved from a firewall having, if you wanted to go over a certain, to use a certain protocol, you would use different ports in the firewall. And then everything switched to being either port 80 or port 443, so just HTTP or SSL. And firewalls didn't work the same way anymore. You couldn't have a rule to do all these things. So they had to kind of redo the firewalls. But there were a class of technologies that said, well, we know that all of your cloud services are running over 18.443. So we're now going to just look and see where is your cloud traffic going? And then build a big list and compare that against the approved ones. Right. So the thing they were called CASB, Cloud Access Security Brokers or something. And it's a similar thing with AI, where one of the first things to do is to say, look, we have an approved process, and you can use a sandbox and you can do these things. And also, we're going to know when you're using this stuff and you're using our data. Or we're going to block it, or we're going to do other things as well. So I think it's that two-part strategy, like give people a path and say, yeah, we think there's potential. Bring your ideas to us. Help us to kind of see, where do you want to innovate? But at the same time, don't just allow chaos, as we've seen in the papers. Right, a few companies have found out the hard way where they've either uploaded intellectual property into one of these models, or they've done other things that's led to backlash. So I think it's really that two-part strategy. How do we allow it in a safe way? And then how do we make sure that when people are being unsafe, that we're aware of that, we can take some action against it?
Got it. Yeah. And I absolutely love that take. And, we're kind of reaching the end of this conversation, but the last thing I'd actually like to learn from you is, how are you feeling about the future? Are you feeling fairly optimistic? I'm sure everything that you're doing, you're building and you're leading at HP. So you've got to feel optimistic and you're probably building that out. But in terms of what you guys are doing and then what you see from your counterparts and your peers and others.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of optimism around what some of these new tools can do. And I think also there is more. It's very hard to retrofit some of these things. So when you do get to build it right from the ground up, it's a lot easier. And we saw with GDPR a few years back where companies were like, I never designed these systems to be able to pull all the information about someone together in one place. They were, large companies that are growing through acquisition. They had all these silos and data stores, and it was very, very hard to kind of pull those together. But once you've done that, there's a lot of business benefit as well from being able to say, oh, now I've got this, 360 view of the customer or omni-channel or whatever you want to call it. So there are those benefits as well. And I think with all of these kind of waves of change, once you come through it, you'll be like, oh yeah, cloud is just the way we do things. And I think these AI enabled tools will be just the way we do things in the future. This one may be, maybe more societally impacting, I think, than some of the waves we've gone through before. But, talking to my kids about, they literally couldn't believe I didn't have a phone when I was their age. And what did you do? Well, we just did what we did because we didn't know any different. So I think we'll be in that position in a few years' time where people will wonder how we ever manage without some of the tools that we have and we will have access to in the future. But it's the job of kind of the governance professionals now to say, that's one possible future. One of these other possible futures is all of these other things, right? And you mentioned Castle earlier, but we still get spam today for all of the, however many millions and billions of dollars have been spent on anti-spam technologies. We still get robocalls, at least in the US. So I think there are some lessons that we can learn to build some of these controls in early so we don't end up in this situation where we're still cleaning up that mess 10, 20, however many years later.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're 100% right about that. I will still to this day have tons of spam that hit my inbox. And again, unfortunately, I think when it becomes big on the news, when you hear whether it was Amazon recently, right, Meta, when there's a massive fine or there's risk from some of the big guys, then everybody else starts to freak out. But I think the smaller businesses, even mid-market, they don't feel as exposed. They don't feel that they're in as much of a risk compared to some of the larger organizations that are trying to be a little bit more proactive.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things with that is that the regulators are getting better. They're getting smarter as well. And there's a lot of things in newer laws that you can actually check from a web browser as to whether someone's compliant or not. Right? If you think about that iceberg analogy, there's this bit that's sticking above the water. The regulators can now run a script and say, do you respond to a global privacy control signal? Do you have some of these things on your website that you need to do? Do you have a do not sell link? Or if you don't, do you have an explanation as to why? Right? There's a lot of these things where once the regulators can just say, okay, just scan 1,000 companies and it'll be almost like a parking ticket or a speeding ticket where you can just do it in scale rather than have to have. And I think that's where smaller companies or medium-sized companies should be worried, because if they're not using those tools, believe me, the regulators are starting to use them. So that would be something that I would be concerned about, because just that the security through obscurity, as we know, is not really security. And I think that obscurity for some of these privacy controls that's been, well, we've got policies internally and a lot of this stuff never sees the light of day. It's changing with some of these new laws that require that external visibility and footprint. So I think that's something where if you are a medium-sized business, you should be understanding what a regulator can see. And potentially, like we saw at the end of last year, where the company got fined for not responding to the GPC signal under CPRA, that kind of stuff could happen to any company that's got a website, right? So
Yeah.
that's something that, potentially you could get a fine without even knowing that a regulator was looking at.
For those, mid-market or even smaller businesses that aren't taking compliance, proactive taking compliance, any recommendations for where they should look to educate themselves?
I think there are a lot of resources out there, but there's always, as you said earlier, that resource allocation problem, right? If you're focused on so many things, compliance doesn't get any cheaper the longer you leave it. So doing even a little bit at the start, kind of working on those bigger things, right? I've worked in security teams where there were like one or two people, but it was a lot better than having no people. And you gradually kind of over time, you mature on those programs. So I would say start off with something small and work out kind of what problem it is you're trying to solve. But if you can bring it back to kind of aligning with the overall business objectives, right? We want our customers to trust us. Surveys have shown that customers that actually trust less churn, they're likely to give you more data, helps you personalize things better, differentiated experience from your competitors. But those are the kinds of things I think if you just talk about compliance, it turns people off. But if you can say, well, we can be compliant, and just like my GDPR example, if we find all this data, what can we do with it once we know that? Like, what are the, brainstorm, like what are all the business benefits we can get? Oh, by the way, that also needs to be compliance. And that's the way that I would look at it, is to say, you're not going to build a heavyweight compliance program for a small or medium business, but you can start off by saying, particularly ones that are still private, if we were going to go IPO, what would we need to do? And that's when a lot of them really start getting serious about these things. It's like, we're going to go IPO in 18 months. Okay, let's build a compliance program. I've seen that several times. So that could be another trigger as well. But you don't want to be in that position where you're the poor person who has to come in from nothing and build it up in 18 months. That's a lot of work against a company that's not got that culture to really be doing the right thing as part of everything they do.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that you mentioned that, trying to, instead having people focus on the risks of it, focus on the possibilities with building out a program like this. Actually, I'll take me to my last question. Again, this was one of the questions we asked while we were at IAPP. We asked it to a lot of the privacy professionals, other sponsors who were there. But final question, how could you recommend other enterprise businesses build a culture of compliance at the ground level, right? From each employee. Is it through just regular education and training? You mentioned you guys are doing, conferences and seminars to your employees in HV. How do you think is the best way for employees who are not, focused on privacy to start thinking like that?
Yeah, I think they shouldn't necessarily be focused on privacy, right? They can't be focused on everything. They've got their job to do. So it's making it as easy as possible for them to find the right answer, right? If I go to the internet and I say, I want to do X, Y, Z, how can that answer be one of the top two search results? And that's one of the great use cases I've seen for kind of the generative AI, is to organize a lot of this knowledge that companies have that's often very inaccessible. The answers aren't always obvious. And I think that's really where I'd want to be in a position similar to, one of the things that eBay is great at is search. Their search is phenomenal. It always has been. You can, use, I want a rear seatbelt and a front seatbelt. So I will eliminate any listings that have front in the, so a lot of those things, and we can do that. But a lot of organizations that I work with, they're very bad at knowledge management. So for me, kind of getting that answer, enabling people by getting them the answer when they have the question in as easy a way and in the right format that it works for them, right? Is it office hours where once a week they can dial in and just ask their question? Is it that they go to the intranet and they, have a search function? It's probably a combination of all of these if you're a larger organization, but it should be that people really don't have to think about privacy at all because it's just built into the way that they do things, right? Anything that's compliance, as soon as compliance is hard, people will find a way around it.
Absolutely. It kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier. Find people where they're at. If they have a question, be there with the answer. So I love that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for joining us today on Comply or Die. Where can people find you if they need to find you?
easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn. There are several Aaron Wellers. One was a high school quarterback, I remember. One runs a domain service in Australia, but you should be able to work out that which one is the privacy one. That's probably the best place to find me.
Excellent. And we'll be sure to link your LinkedIn as well. But thanks again, Aaron. And we'll make sure Aaron Weller from HP, not the quarterback. Thanks again and have a great day.
Thanks very much.
You've tuned in to the Comply or Die podcast. If you found this episode informative, we would appreciate it if you could take a moment to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us reach a wider audience and spread the knowledge. Don't forget to share the podcast with your friends or colleagues who could benefit from these insights. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Until next time, stay informed, stay compliant, and stay in business.